Hello and welcome to the President's and the Prime Minister's podcast. I'm Iain Dale. Now, you've experienced 55 episodes of this podcast so far, all about British Prime Ministers. We're now embarking on 45 different American presidents. Some of you may think, well, there were 46. We're on the 46th one, but of course Grover Cleveland served twice as president, so there are actually only 45 different ones. Now, over the next 45 weeks, we're going to hear from the authors of the different essays in my book, The Presidents, and believe me, there's a variety of people. It's a mixture of historians, academics, politicians, and journalists. And I think one of the things that I've learned from editing this book is that there are various themes that transcend virtually all presidents. Slavery is one of them, even that, obviously, with the Black Lives Matter movement, and that really features in modern-day presidents as well as the ones in the 18th and 19th centuries. So I'm really going to enjoy interviewing all of the contributors to the book. And today we're going to start off with Lord Owen, David Owen, who, of course, was Foreign Secretary in the UK between 1977 and 79. So he overlapped with Jimmy Carter. In fact, he became Foreign Secretary just after Jimmy Carter's inauguration in 1977. David, welcome. I was absolutely delighted when you agreed to write about Jimmy Carter, because obviously you can bring a personal perspective into the narrative here. What are your personal memories of Jimmy Carter as a person?
Well, I remember carrying the line in the White House, first Jim Callaghan and Audrey Callaghan, and then my wife and myself. And my wife puts out her hand and says, "I voted for you."
It's because, of course, Debbie is American.
She's American, yeah. So he was charming. He was both
that broke the ice.
Yeah, broke the ice, certainly. And I think that I do believe he's had a bum rap from history, and I think it needs to be corrected. And I think we forget how formidable, actually, his record is in only a one-term president, but the reason why he didn't get re-elected is well known, and we'll discuss that, no doubt, around. But I think he was very brave in putting the Panama Canal at the top of his agenda. It was an issue which every single president for 20 or 30 years had been avoiding. And he was told that it's dangerous, and the chiefs of staff were quite clear that there could be fighting if they didn't make progress. So he dedicated the first more or less year of his presidency to this issue and got it through. And treaties need 2/3 majorities. He was not popular, and he yet persuaded a lot of Republicans to vote the treaty through because it was the right thing to do.
Well, let's start at the beginning. Where did he come from? Because he in many ways, he was a very unlikely president with his background, not just his family background, but he was the governor of a southern state. There weren't many of them that became president. He was born in Plains, Georgia in 1924. What kind of upbringing did he have?
He was a peanut farmer and proud of it, and quite successful, although I think it was quite a hard living, and he had to keep his costs down if he was going to work commercially. So he comes in, and the next thing to know about him is his wife, and there is no doubt that they were a team, and she was in a very natural, not in a upsetting way. She was central. There was barely a single decision that she was not involved in. They talked politics. And I think she often was good for him, too. Made helpful contributions.
And she was a very different kind of First Lady to most, in fact, I would say virtually all of her. Well, maybe she was the nearest to Eleanor Roosevelt that we've seen in modern times, in that she was intensely political.
Yes, no, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Those two were hugely political women and had considerable influence on them. Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, had a different, tense relationship with her husband and other things, but he was still respected her and her judgment. And Jimmy Carter was really close, and he respected her judgment too. But Jimmy Carter was basically an engineer in the Navy, a nuclear engineer, and he had a disciplined mind. And he didn't make decisions without the facts before him. And he was hugely interested, incidentally, in the environment and started some of the big issues of solar power and conservation and energy, unsung elements in his presidency. But I think that when you said yes to his strengths over the Panama Treaty, he blew relations with the Russians basically throughout the whole of his period. I mean, there'd been a sort of Vladivostok agreement between President Ford and Kissinger with Brezhnev and Gromyko. And the Russians were expecting this to be taken on by the new president and have a quick deal, which was already there in the pipeline. And many of experts around the world thought that was going to do. And it was Jimmy Carter who insisted on sending his Secretary of State Vance with two propositions, but the first one was the one that was off-put the Russians, which was basically putting Vladivostok to one side and coming up with a very ambitious program. In my view, this was a really serious mistake, and Vance was not happy with it, but he thought he could bring the second option up. The Russians, I think, foolishly didn't allow Vance really to get the second option really on the table. They just were intensely irritated and wanted to show him, put him down really, and they just froze all talks. So the man who could have made some very serious nuclear arms controls, who understood it and was very committed to it, ended up in having nothing.
If we go back to his pre-presidential career, he was governor of Georgia. And when did he first think about running for president?
Well, it's been revealed that his wife made soundings when the previous candidate, vice president, had to admit that he'd not fessed up to his depressive illness and his treatment and had to be pulled right at the last moment. And so he was, even in the presidential election before him, ready to be chosen.
Ed Muskie, I think his name was, wasn't it, in 1972? Or was it Terry Eagleton? Eagleton. Why did I think it was Muskie?
Yes.
Anyway.
Who didn't fess up to his Democratic candidate, presidential candidate. I think that I shouldn't make too much of that, but I think that he was deeply ambitious, and he showed that very early on when he was governor. He joined the Trilateral. Trilateral was a mechanism really to get America engaged with Japan, where there was very little dialogue. There was dialogue with Russia, there was dialogue with, beginning with China, but Japan, which was a huge, and still is, a huge economic power, was totally outside. And he joined the Trilateral. And I was a member of the Trilateral for quite a long time. And it was a very good educative force. You went to Tokyo and you really saw Japanese people who normally you just couldn't get hold of. And Brzezinski was operating that, and that was where Zbigniew Brzezinski became a friend of Carter's and respected, and why he chose him to be his security advisor.
So he decided to run for president, went through the primaries. Well, was that quite a bruising process? I've got a book called Marathon, The Race for the Presidency in 1976. Now, I read it donkeys years ago, but it was quite an interesting race, that one.
Yes, because nobody gave him any chance, Jimmy who, and he took on and took out some rather important Democratic figures, if you really think of it, both And he managed to get the support of right-wing Democrat candidates who didn't, in his home states and in the South, who didn't really agree with him. You see, it's not very easy to categorize him. Was he left or right? That doesn't work with Jimmy Carter. Was he Southern or was he Central? No, he wasn't really Southern, but he delivered the hard right vote, and that's what got him home. It was a very tight election. I think his problem was that the Nixon scandal, Watergate, and then Ford, decent man, but rather plodding, took to this self-confessed born-again Christian and all this, I'll never lie to you and all this thing. So he seemed a new voice, and he seemed unpretentious and attractive, really. It was different.
And he seemed to have quite a lot of charisma, certainly in the campaign, and that sort of that smile which kind of lit up his face. But as his presidency went on, that all seemed to go, and he became almost a depressing figure to look at. And we'll come on to what that was maybe in a moment. And America in 1977, I mean, let's remember, it was just getting over Vietnam, it was just getting over Watergate, not an easy thing for a comparatively inexperienced president to walk into. But, as you say, he had rather more achievements to his name than we possibly like to remember now. And you make the point in your essay that it's only in the last couple of years that anybody's written a full biography of him, which seems extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. I mean, he's the nearly man. He did eventually get the Nobel Peace Prize. But, I mean, his biggest achievement is in getting the settlement with Sadat and Begin at Camp David, which has lasted completely unchanged throughout all these years.
Well, let's talk about that. How did that come about? I mean, how did he get involved?
He undoubtedly wanted to make a mark in that area. He sensed, without meeting him, that Sadat was different and a devout Muslim, but married to an engaging woman, nurse, and that message got through to him, and he asked that Begin and Sadat would come in 9 months' time, quite a long time ahead, to see him in America. And then suddenly, of course, everything in the Middle East changed when Sadat flew into Israel. I mean, here was Egypt, military Air Force commander of the forces, you know, one of the people close to NASA, coming in this extraordinary gesture. And some people say it was stimulated out of fear that America might go on with the American-Russian conference on the Middle East, which was the last thing Sadat wanted. And he wanted the Russians out of his country, and he wanted to be in the driving seat for a new future. I don't think he had any idea how Begin would respond. He just knew the Begin that we all knew as a hardline right-wing leader.
And he was a difficult, prickly character, Begin, wasn't he?
Absolutely. I mean, we got Callahan sent a message to me when I was literally days into the Foreign Office and said, what do you think about inviting Mr. Begin to London? And then apparently he said to one of his aides, now we'll discover who's in charge of the Foreign Office.
Well, because the Foreign Office had and has a reputation of being quite pro-Arab.
Would say no. And, of course, they did say no. And I, of course, said yes. So there we are. But, I mean, I had studied the Middle East. And the last, when the Labour Party was out of office, I first of all went into business, and then in high tech and behavioral things, and then I went into a job looking at the Middle East, which had David Astor, who was the editor of The Observer, and Duncan Sands and George Thompson as the things, and all they really had was this small charity. And it meant that I had already been to Egypt and had seen General Sisi, I think, right out of the desert, who modelled himself on Mountbatten, not Mountbatten, who modelled himself on Montgomery. And it was clear that change was in the air in Egypt, and they were going to attack. This was in 1973. It was clear they were going to attack. And I went around Israel a lot. And then, of course, you had the 73 war, which changed things. I think the most important thing that Carter did was push immediately after the flight into Israel for the two leaders to meet. Begin had cancelled our meeting. He did come to London, was coming to London, and he had to cancel it, and he couldn't tell us why. We didn't know. And they thought it was rather rude. And then, of course, we flew in.
Civil Service
was really kept very
so,
secret.
Foreign Secretary.
And then he felt so committed to coming that he announced his visit very soon afterwards without even consulting us on the date. So Jim just bit it on the bullet and didn't mind. And we had an amazing conversation with him. And it is worth giving a little bit of understanding this guy. He said at the end of the meeting, Jim said, is there anything you'd like to do? After all, this was the man who bombed King David, killed British soldiers and everything like this. And he said, yes, I'd like to go to the room where the Balfour Declaration was signed. And so Jim said, oh, David will take you there now, no problem at all, which is exactly what I did. And as we were going up in this lift, which in those days was still very slow in order to cope with Bevin's heart, I could see he was praying. So we got out. Before I went into my room, I said, I don't want anybody else. I just the Prime Minister. And it was a shrine. It was a religious ceremony. He was praying to himself. And then I thought, I must give him some recognition. And there were all these Hansards, gold embraced and everything like that. And I gave him this Hansard, and vanity being always high there, I chose one with a speech which I had made condemning Ted Heath over not supplying the ammunition for the Centurion tanks that we'd sold to the Israelis. His son later came to see me after he died, and he said this was the most treasured possession of my father's life. He told everybody, this book was there at the time the Balfour Declaration was signed. And he said none of the family dared tell him that actually it was not true. And he went to his grave thinking, now it shows you all this emotion that was behind this man, huge emotion. And he knew that having had that gesture from Sadat, he had to do something. And he gave ground in the only area where he could, which was give back every hectare of the Sinai Desert, which was initially with Egypt. It was a hell of a brave thing to do. And I think that Carter seemed to understand that. And I heard a lot of accounts from it just over the years from Cyrus Vance, who became one of my great friends. And we'd sort of reminisce, whether it was in the Balkans or some other ghastly place doing some horrible things. And he'd give me an insight into it. He was full of praise and never criticized. I mean, they had their differences sort of thing, and eventually, but I think the sheer commitment of time that Carter gave to this problem should never be underestimated.
And also, it wasn't that long into his presidency. It was 18 months in. That's when Camp David took place, September 1978. Was he a natural peacemaker? Did he a bit like, I'm trying to think of a modern day equivalent, somebody who was just really good at bringing people together and then maybe letting them get on with it?
I don't think anybody would have said that would be a great characteristic of Jimmy Carter, but I think it was very important. He was put in the time. He played on their religious backgrounds of all three of them. And I think that at that moment in history, I don't think anybody else could have done that. I think it required a pretty committed Christian for the US president as well as those two.
Do you think he was a very widely read man? Because most American presidents, when they come into office, I mean, there are exceptions to this, but they don't have much experience of foreign affairs, and I suspect he was probably one of those. But to have got himself up to speed in such a quick time on an immensely complicated subject probably said a lot about him.
Yeah, he did his homework. I mean, in that sense, he was a nuclear engineer, and he knew that you had to know the facts. He respected the facts. So he came to the subject knowing a lot about it. He had a very good team around him. And it was a very wise idea to go to Camp David, away from as far as possible, away from telephones. No, I think it was a staggering triumph, for which he, of course, should have had. The other two had the Nobel Prize. He should have had the Nobel Prize for that. It left him a slightly sad figure. He went on over the years doing many things, all of them good things. But he hoped he would be more influential on peacekeeping, and no American president was ready to give him really the time of day for that. So he was moving against a reluctance in the White House to give him plenipotentiary powers. So he didn't have a lot of successes, but he sure tried.
We'll come on to Iran and the hostages in a moment, but in terms of domestic achievement and the American economy, that was, I mean, it's very easy to blame his defeat in 1980 purely on the Iran hostage situation, but I think it goes a lot deeper than that, in that the economy was floundering. He made that awful television address talking about the sort of the sense of national malaise, which is not what Americans want to hear, is it? I mean, they want a sort of upbeat message. And Reagan was able to capitalize on that with his sunny morning in America type rhetoric.
I think Reagan was a brilliant candidate against that particular person.
Yeah.
Because Reagan, who didn't know a lot, could easily be shown up to not be terribly knowledgeable. But this chap was so intense. I think Americans were fed up with this intensity, and having Reagan's capacity to sort of sit back and would he say, "There you go again," or something? It was bad luck. Reagan was a good candidate against him, and the events of history were against him. Nevertheless, in terms of output, in terms of things done, it was a very productive presidency.
You mentioned environmental legislation. I mean, there was quite a lot of that. But in terms of the economy itself, inflation was, I mean, it wasn't just in America this was happening, of course, it was happening in Britain as well. But inflation was quite high, unemployment was rising. They weren't very, I mean, he didn't have a great economic record.
He didn't inflate the economy to try and get out of it. He appointed Volcker, easily the best head of the Federal Reserve we've ever had, I think, in certainly my lifetime. And he knew you put Volcker in that position, he's going to squeeze out inflation and he's going to take a tough line, which he did. But he thought he was the best man for the job, which he was. So he left a good legacy. But he paid a price. That he looked at the issues, saw what was necessary, appointed the man who would handle it, and he knew it would make it harder for him to win the election.
Moving back to foreign affairs, you talk in the essay about the Rhodesia Zimbabwe agreement, which obviously you spent a lot of time on. What was the American involvement in that?
Well, he made it very clear that they were going to get involved in Africa. He sent his vice president down to South Africa and told them in no uncertain terms that apartheid was unacceptable. And they'd never been spoken to like that before. And when we went over, Callaghan was president of the European Council at that time, so it was a good time to go. We presented him with the first time, really, that Britain made it clear that one person, one vote. And, I would not countenance anything else. And those days were over. And that helped, because they were not going to go and work with the old-style British government compromising on A and B roles and all that sort of stuff around Africa. So we were on the same page. We were on the same page on human rights. And Andy Young was a much more important figure in Carter's life. And people scoffed at Andy. He was a
representative of the UN.
Yes, he was a representative of the UN, but went around Africa a lot. And I don't mind saying, I mean, it's a pain in the arse sometimes, because he was, he would, he would empathize. He was the best empathizer I've ever known in my life. He'd empathize with Julius Nyerere when we were in Tanzania, and then he'd empathize with Ian Smith when we were in Salisbury. I used to be kicking him under the table and he'd say, David, I'm a preacher. But he did bring to Africa a new voice, a committed voice on the side of against any form of prejudice against the color of your skin, deep-seated voice from the president down of the United States. And he therefore was a huge asset overall in the negotiations, and we had to cope with it. And so on Namibia, on or Southwest Africa, as it was called, on South Africa itself, and on Rhodesia, there was a clear voice going out to the world. And when the young African leader who was beaten to death and travelled in the back of a lorry, naked and shackled, died, we managed to take the world through the fact that South Africa was a threat to the peace, and we could then put economic sanctions on them. And that was very difficult for the British government to do. And I could never have done it without Callaghan giving me total support. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Board of Trade, a lot of the civil service were totally against it, needed the British industry and business arguments. But we went through it, and from that moment on, we were treated seriously. But if we had tried to duck sanctions against South Africa, we'd have not had an Anglo-American plan for Rhodesia and the rest of Africa. We also set up the first mechanism for negotiating dealing with Southwest Africa, and which the foreign ministers negotiated directly with the South African president and foreign minister and the head of their army. And that was a very, very important negotiation. 12 years later, on that resolution of the UN, Namibia got independence. But there were some very important changes in the world during that period, and I was lucky enough to work with Cy Vance, who was a very principled, very lovely man.
And Carter got on well with Jim Callaghan, but didn't get on so well with Helmut Schmidt, you wrote.
No, Helmut Schmidt hated him. And it was mutual, as they say.
You say Carter saw Schmidt as foul-tempered and treated him with arrogant disdain.
Yes. I'm a great supporter of Helmut Schmidt, but he could be quite tough. It was difficult. Carter came in and determined to get rid of fast breeder reactors because you were getting plutonium and you wouldn't be able to control plutonium and you were going to get a widespread nuclear weapons. He was right on all counts. But the way he said about it was not the best, and Giscard d'Estaing in France and Helmut Schmidt were not going to be told by quite as bluntly as they were being told. It was very poorly handled. Callahan was head of the G7 at that time, and we had a meeting in London, and he smoothed the path. He got Jimmy Carter to become more flexible and to come off his high horse, and he got Helmut to cool down and Giscard to stop treating Carter a sort of disdain of a true snob. And they all eventually got together quite well. But it was not not an easy time.
Let's move on to talk about Iran, because, as you said earlier, that was a major reason for Jimmy Carter's defeat in 1980. Take us through the events of that time with regard to Iran.
Well, very soon in his presidency, Jimmy Carter got the taste of what was coming in Iran, in that there were crowds of demonstrators outside the White House. And it's actually the gates and the encasement is pretty close. And they were all making speeches, Carter and the Shah. And CS gas had been used to get the demonstrators to disperse. And the audience was, with eyes streaming down their eyes with drops of water. And he realized then, I think, that this is not going to be a simple problem. There's a lot of dissent here in America from Iranian students to what's going on in the Shah. Then he went and down that Christmas, I think, made a dreadful speech of praising the Shah. You know, we all have praised people who have to do this, but I mean, it was a sort of endorsement of unbelievable generosity, to say the least, and very ill-advised. So he angered even further the dissident opinion. So Carter was odd with the way he handled this. I mean, it was realistic. I mean, Iran mattered, and Iran was, a big purchaser of arms, and also a big supplier of oil, and had been nurtured a relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which was a strong one under Kissinger and Nixon. So it was important to America, and he was right on that. And then he came in rather late in 78, 79. And the real problems were pretty much there by the middle of 77. And we'd all got used to accepting the Shah as an ally. We in Britain acquiesced in not putting MI6 into Iran. It was a great mistake. I mean, I inherited the program, but I could have changed it, and I didn't. And it meant that we were blindsided on quite a lot of things, too dependent on information from the Shah's people, and too indulgent to SAVAK, which was a very nasty authoritarian police force. But you can't run somebody else's country, and not as somebody as powerful as the Shah. I saw him in 77, and
but at that point, could you see the end coming?
I'd twice been to Iran already, so I mean, I did know the country reasonably. I think that we were pretty worried about the Shah, but there seemed no way other than support. You could talk to him about human rights, and I did, and he took it reasonably well. did some things. I mean, one of the stories was that the whole emphasis of Jimmy Carter on human rights was what got rid of the Shah. It was absolute bullshit. The problem was the Shah was indecisive. He was born indecisive. He was indecisive when he was toppled, went to Rome, had to be told when to come back. And this man didn't like making decisions. And when, about 10 years before, there was some rioting and his chief minister, Alam, came to see him. And he said, we've got to put this down. And he said, well, what have we got to do? He said, bullets, Your Majesty. And he said, I'll do it. And if it fails, I'm for the sack. And he did it, put down right from early on, it was clear that Shah was against military power. I mean, it was a good instinct in some respects, but it had this massive army and gold braid everywhere you went, and British built tanks and things like that. But he was just extraordinarily indecisive.
So when he eventually left the country and the revolution started and Khomeini took over, what was Jimmy Carter's attitude to all of that?
Well, by then we knew why he was indecisive. He was indecisive because that was his constitutional makeup, but he was also indecisive because he was suffering from a very serious blood disease. And if we had known that, of course, we would have been able to do what he wanted. His medical secrets were kept by the French. I've written a whole book, chapters and books about this. And we didn't know. I think Giscard d'Estaing did know. So he was not going to let British or American doctors know. And even his wife didn't know for a long time. And this made his indecision much worse. We should have, the way to deal with him at that juncture, had we known, and I think that Vance and I could have done it, would be to make it clear to, even if he didn't want to tell people, we would have told people that he was suffering with a very serious illness and he was going off to Switzerland to be treated. And a regency would have been appointed. And that was the only real route. Well, he stood there, there was no way. And the military were useless. Americans put in an American general, Carter, in January of 79, wasn't it? Yeah. And there was the general found that none of his generals wanted to do anything. And when he asked the Shah, it was clear the Shah was not prepared to use them. So they were a very, very expensive ornament and were not used. They did at one time use CS gas, the piece. I was asked very early on, will you supply CS gas? I did supply CS gas. What else was doing? You were day by day putting your ambassador in to say, don't open fire on the dissenters. And they had tanks in the streets day after day. Don't fire on the demonstrators. Well, will you supply CS gas? Yes. These are the sort of decisions you have to take in life, not very pleasant. But by the end of, middle of 78, it was over. Mm-hmm. And I said, we must stay loyal. You can't second guess this. When they go, they go. And later I went with the Queen to Saudi Arabia and to Kuwait, and after the Shah had gone. And they were full of praise, and it meant something to them that we had shown loyalty, that we hadn't second-guessed. But it's a very nasty situation. We won't see that again, probably, in the world. A very rich, powerful, we thought, figure, but actually a man of no substance, strength.
So what led to the hostage crisis? And let's talk about how Jimmy Carter managed that.
Well, there are two views of this. He was sold by the military a strategy of landing clandestinely helicopters into the desert area, which goes quite close up to Tehran, and the idea that you could fly these helicopters into the American embassy where all the people were hostages and take them out without them being killed. This idea went through Brzezinski, went through the military. When it went to Vance, he thought it was madness. He couldn't understand it. He'd been Deputy Secretary of Defense. He served in the war. He wasn't sure. He may have sounded a moderate person, but he knew how to use force. He was against it. Anyhow, they went ahead against his advice. They had some bad luck. The helicopters went wrong, but that sort of operation had no insufficient built-in reserves. And it was a total and utter humiliation. I think it would have been worse if they even landed. I don't personally believe they would have got away with it. And from then on, Jimmy Carter's obsession was he had to get these people out. He introduced world economic sanctions of banks and of transfers of money, some of which we use now to deal with dictators and things, which were never used before and are very powerful. But it didn't have the desired effect on a regime which was predictably savage and no respect of human rights. All the things I had warned about materialized. The idea that you could have openly welcomed what was coming in through the Ayatollahs was absurd. But that was many sort of liberal-minded people thought was the best alternative. Well, they were shaken too when what happened. But as far as this, it was all bad news. And Jimmy Carter elevated it. And so the count was going on. If you went to America, it was day 10, day 20, day 30. Yeah. And it obsessed his ministry. I think he did actually spread himself still pretty wide. But it was the first real example, I think, for America of their impotence in facing a regime, fundamentally terrorist regime, you know.
And it was a shock to the American psyche, wasn't it?
Deeply. It was. They were unable to do anything about it. They threw the kitchen sink at the issue, and it didn't make any difference. And the regime made it clear right at the end of his presidency. It wasn't until he had Reagan had taken the oath of office and Jimmy Carter was flying out of Washington that they lifted the embargo.
Mm.
They were not going to give him any credit for it, whatever.
Yeah.
Reagan, in a rather generous gesture, made it possible for Carter to go to Germany and to meet the people from diplomats who'd been held in these pretty nasty circumstances, actually. I mean, people didn't make much of it because it was not going to help, but it was no picnic that they were under. So it affected everything. Yeah. And it had a damaging effect on all of us in the Western world.
41 years later, he's still alive. He's had, I mean, of all of the presidents that there have been since 1789, I mean, Hoover lived way beyond his presidency. And there have been one or two, but I think Carter is the longest surviving.
Yes, and it was a very active retirement. I mean, he built this centre in Atlanta. He travelled around the world. He tried to settle many things. He did a huge amount for public health and for water supplies and for famine and how to use new techniques of farming.
And he would do a lot of the work himself.
Yes, yes. It's an amazing record. He was upset that he never got much recognition for it. But he went on, regardless. Eventually he was given a Nobel Peace Prize because he was a man who was dedicated to peace and is still, as we speak, he's still alive. And I think that he is owed the respect of history, that you can have the humiliation, really, of being defeated in those circumstances, and you can turn your office at the disposal of the world and in modest ways, but cumulatively important, contribute a great deal on all the issues of the world: hunger, war fighting, the need for peace, famine. He was a genuinely good man.
When we look at the league tables of American presidents, he features in the third quartile generally. Do you think that's fair?
I don't know. I'd like to hope that he'd
I think I'd like to raise him to the top half.
I would like to put him into the top half. But I don't know. America is a very interesting country, and I think that when he dies, there will be an outpouring of gratitude, and there will be a feeling that this was a man who earned respect for America around the world while being disrespected by his own country. And I think there'll be a readjustment of things. And I like to think that he'll be in the top 50% of American presidents.
Well, maybe this podcast can contribute to that. David Owen, thank you very much indeed. Well, I hope you'll join us again in future weeks to hear about more American presidents. Next week, we're going to be talking to Simon Heffer about the life and career of Ronald Reagan. He's come up in today's podcast as well. Now, my book, The Presidents, it is published on November the 18th, 2021, in hardback, £25 from Hodder and Stoughton. You can also get it as an ebook and download the audiobook if you prefer listening to books rather than reading them. Thank you very much for listening and indeed watching this podcast. Goodbye.